right. So thank you for joining today. Hi, Lucy. Hi, Mahmoud. Hi, Grant. Hi, Musa. And yeah, thank you so much for joining. Um, feel free to say hi in the chat, and yeah, feel free to also drop in why you were interested in this chat. That would be really helpful. And also feel free to also write if your background is more on the digital rights side, or if you work for an organization like a humanitarian organization. That would be really helpful. So today, I'm just going to be chatting about humanitarian chatbots, and really asking, how can we meet people where they are while supporting digital rights? So today, I'd love to have a discussion, basically, around this, and I would really love this to be participatory. How I'll start is with just moving to the next slide. How I'll start is with a bit of background about chatbots, and the history of chatbots, particularly in the humanitarian sector. I'll then sort of share some examples from the MENA region, and then dive into a case study of a chatbot I've been working on over the past few months. I'd then love to just speak about some of the data protection measures that we've taken before having a discussion, and really kind of I'm really keen to hear your thoughts. And so just to start maybe with a bit about my sort of my positionality, like why am I interested in this? Why am I giving this? Why have I signed up to do this talk today? So I'm British Lebanese, and I sort of work with a foot both in the digital rights space, and also in the humanitarian sector. So I have had the pleasure of working with SMEX, for instance, and other actors thinking about data protection and responsible data. And at the same time, I've worked more kind of implementing and like building out technology with and for communities that are affected by conflict. I also want to frame this discussion just by saying that I think it's really important to be having this conversation at Bread&Net. And I'll get into that more in the next few slides, but just given the level of given that oftentimes the communities we're working with are Arabic speaking, and then just thinking about where the policies and guidance are often coming from, that's often not from the countries that we're in. So just kind of wanted to have a bit more dialogue, and really try to begin to I guess break silos between humanitarian organizations and digital rights activists in the region. I think there's a lot to learn. So just starting off with a bit of background. Since 2015, chatbots have been commonly used. They're automated messaging. You can find them on WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, and more recently WhatsApp as well. The early chatbots really started in the 1960s, but re-emerged in 2015, 2016. With the rise of, a combination of three factors, actually. So smartphones, natural language processing, and AI. So the combo of those three really made it much more feasible for mostly businesses to develop chatbots. And at the same time, that has really correlated with a rising and growing humanitarian need. So I just want to give a bit of background here about what humanitarianism is, and it's defined as the practice of saving lives and alleviating suffering. So at the end of 2019, there were 79.5 million forcibly displaced people in the world. That's 1% of everyone in the world is forcibly displaced. Of that, you'll notice a sharp rise from the early to mid 2010s. It's almost doubled in the last decade. And the majority are actually in the Arab world. So 13.2 million displaced people are from Syria, 3.7 million from Yemen, 2.2 million are from Iraq. And then there are also 5.6 million refugees under UNRWA's mandate. So that's about 30% or so that are Arabic speaking. And I think it's also worth noting here that the humanitarian sector is a multi-billion-dollar sector as well. And I think I raise that just to say that I think it's something to keep in mind when thinking as well about the kinds of technologies we're talking about. So the scale of the organizations involved in humanitarian response are quite large. And humanitarian actors are interested in chatbots I've narrowed it down to 3 key reasons. So in the early 2010s, or around then, the sector sort of had an awakening that there were information gaps. And there's this great quote from the CDAC network, which I'll just read out to you, which is that information can save lives and help mitigate risk. It's essential that the right people get the right information at the right time through the right channels. Knowing what's happening, where to go for assistance, how to avoid further risk, and who to call for help is crucial to a community's survival and recovery. So this idea of communication is aid really grew within and became an integrated part of humanitarian response. At the same time, there's this idea of meeting people where they are. And where they are is increasingly online. So some research from GSMA, which is the global mobile body, was basically, the research was about refugee populations in Jordan, Uganda, and Rwanda. And of those, about 78% owned an internet-enabled phone. And comparing that to Rwanda, that was 43%, and Bidi in Uganda, that was 37%. So this idea of meeting people where they are, and that being online or through messaging apps, that's particularly in relation to Arabic-speaking displaced populations. And then the final reason is really around, I think so, is around scalability and efficiency. So with that increase in displaced populations, which we saw in the previous slide, the funding hasn't increased at the same pace. So the humanitarian sector as a whole is trying to communicate and trying to provide services to displaced people with fewer resources and doing it at greater scale. Of course, though, while those are the reasons why the humanitarian sector is interested in chatbots, there are definitely challenges, and these recur. These I think still very much exist. So the first and a really key one is power dynamics between an organization and affected populations, and then how does that translate in a messaging app? We've also got to think about who is excluded. Oftentimes, the person that can't receive a service or can't communicate with an organization through a chatbot, Perhaps that's because they don't have a phone, and oftentimes they may be like a particularly vulnerable member of a community. So for instance, that might be particularly young, particularly old people. It might be women, perhaps in a particular country, women have less access to phones than men. There's also perhaps literacy gaps as well. So you've got to think about who's excluded. Another key challenge is just around service continuity. So some of the chatbots I will go into in the next slide don't actually exist anymore. So, you know, what happens to people that were using those services? Where are they getting that information instead? And then there are organizational challenges. So, for instance, people working within humanitarian organizations may not have the data literacy. They may not understand some of the data protection issues, or some of the technical issues to do with, for instance, encrypted messaging, or you know, what's the difference, for instance, between a Facebook Messenger chatbot and a WhatsApp chatbot? And yeah, I just wanted to introduce you to some humanitarian chatbot examples, so particularly in the region. So this one on the left is one that UNHCR developed in Jordan. And it was to support, it was actually just a prototype, and it never made it past the prototype stages because it was in Facebook Messenger and all the protection and like data privacy issues with that. But the idea was for it to complement the frequently answered questions and the call center that UNHCR runs in Jordan. And on the right is U-Report, which is developed by UNICEF. It operates in 41 countries, and then there's also a global U-Report. So this was just a screenshot from U-Report Lebanon. And what they do is they send out polls to people and gather data on pressing questions and issues. So it's kind of like a citizen reporting, but more really data collection service. And the reason why they do that is to surface youth voices in particular, and this idea that, you know, to really connect and have a more sort of grassroots understanding of an issue. Yeah, so humanitarian chatbots, and these are chatbot examples from sort of 2015, 2016, mostly 2016, 2017, 2018, actually. And you'll notice that they are across 3 different areas. So actually delivering services. So for instance, in the education sector, being a learning companion and guiding someone through learning. Providing information of different kinds was a huge sort of area where humanitarian organizations were exploring chatbots. So for instance, identifying the nearest health center, or getting timely and reliable information, or supporting crisis-affected communities to identify resettlement pathways. Like navigating a lot of this information can be quite confusing and overwhelming, and so you know, really the way a chatbot works of gathering some information and then responding with a tailored information was why I think they kind of went for chatbots for these. And you'll notice that most of these are actually on Facebook Messenger, which is quite an interesting trend. And then, yeah, the final example there is of data collection and the U-Report example I showed in the previous slide. So a couple of these that I've been looking into are no longer working. So just on that sustainability piece. So for instance, Arsenal, it was no longer working for me. That UNHCR Innovation one in Jordan was just a prototype and didn't go further. Signpost used to have a service in Jordan but I go to that and I get a 404 error. So they've kind of shifted the geographical priorities there. Yeah. So those chatbots kind of were perhaps paused and then, or perhaps not continued, or there was some interest, but they didn't really get too far or too large. Probably Signpost and You Report are the widest, or had the widest reach of those examples. But then 2020 happened. And we have a couple things happening in the background. So WhatsApp released their business API in 2018. And at the same time, COVID happened. And that disrupted in-person service delivery. So it really encouraged humanitarian organizations to think about how they could reach people not in person and thus digitally. So with that, we've seen a real increase in chatbots in 2020. This on the right is the World Health Organization's Health Alert app. So that provides COVID information and the latest stats in a number of different languages. So just by texting marhaba, you get a menu and can navigate through that information. And they've been reaching a vast number of people. I don't have it off the top of my head, but yeah, hundreds of thousands, I think. Sorry about that. At the same time, there seem to be a lot more chatbots in the service delivery space, which makes sense if that in-person delivery isn't happening. So particularly in terms of mental health and health, and then also education has been a huge area. And then there has been some data collection as well. So here I've included examples that are not only in the MENA region, but also beyond. So Agrifin, which is a data collection example, is for Kenyan farmers to report locusts. I think another interesting trend is all of these are WhatsApp, though I was mostly focusing on WhatsApp chatbots, but there's definitely been a shift towards that. And then another general trend that I've been noticing in 2020 is that there are a lot more chatbots not being built just for just in the region, in the Middle East region, but also more in Latin America, responding to displaced Venezuelan communities. So, for instance, in Peru and Colombia. And okay, so I'd love to move now to the case study and just sort of show you what I've been working on recently. So this is the Airbell Impact Lab, which is the research and innovation arm of the IRC. And they have a Middle East hub in Jordan. And so we've been building out some information in two strands. So the first is related to employment. And that is referrals to other job sites and places to look for employment, and also labor rights law under COVID. So Jordan issued a defense order, and it included information about people's rights to wages, rights to rights if their contract was terminated, social security status, and holidays. So we created a chatbot with this information. We've sort of presented it in these graphics, and yeah, just tried to make it a bit more user-friendly. In this first image on the left is the initial opt-in message that a user receives. So it explains what the service is about. It explains what people can opt into, and then goes into information about, if you decide not to opt in, that doesn't affect your right to receive services from the IRC. We explain that we will be collecting minimal information, and what we do collect will be to to support the improvement of the service, and just that they have the ability to opt out at any time. That's also included. And so, yeah, they received 4 options, which was to opt into Mashruat Tashbik, which is this employment service, the mental health service, both services, or none. And then they would go into this menu and then could navigate to the different content. We also created, actually on the same WhatsApp line, we created a well-being service. So that's the mental health service. And this was through design research, we'd recognized that there was a gap, and with that, so not only a gap in service provision, but also how people understood mental health issues. So, for instance, often these were understood in somatic ways, so as back pain or as headaches, and then also in terms of given the lack of service provision in Jordan and also COVID, not only kind of sharing what services were available, but supporting people to support their friends and family who may be experiencing mental health issues. So it was a 5-week campaign run on Facebook and WhatsApp, and each week had a different theme. So, for instance, anxiety, depression, the somatic symptoms, the kinds of services that were available, and people in. So those folks who had opted into the WhatsApp service would receive a message every week from us, and then from there could sort of go through about like 5 to 7 pieces of content. So yeah, on the left here you'll see that initial opt-in, which is much more simpler. It's just a yes/no opt-in, but it includes all the same information that I mentioned for the employment service around the informed consent, and then often the first message, the first like piece of content for each week was often being introduced to a character, and following their journey. We also had videos, which were on YouTube and Facebook Live with a mental health expert who would answer any questions and talk about the issues. And these were normally quite short videos that people could share. And then the week would end with a quiz, which is what this final screenshot on the right is. Yeah, and so then just to go into some of the data protection measures we took. So at an organizational level, there are obviously policies that IRC has and that we follow, and then oversight within that. So, for instance, before launching this, had to discuss both plans and then what this might look like with the head of IT for the region. So there's oversight there. As part of the process, he recommended completing a data protection impact assessment. So that's quite a robust framework, which is required by GDPR. It's not required by Jordanian law, but in terms of like best practice, it's definitely recommended. And there are frameworks within the humanitarian sector which also point towards using a DPIA as best practice. So, for instance, ICRC's data protection rules, I believe that's what it's called. And then I guess the third consideration is that we very purposefully were exploring and testing using WhatsApp for this because of the end-to-end encryption. Though interestingly, that's also definitely been a challenge. So in terms of collecting the kinds of data that we'd really ideally like to collect, So for instance, knowing when a user knowing when a client would share a post or something, that's something we'd love to know, but it's impossible to know because of WhatsApp's end-to-end encryption. So it's striking that balance there. And then in that initial message there was active opt-in. So users knew what they were opting into, and they could also opt out at any time. And each message in that menu contains a press X to opt out. So in the well-being tech chat, clients just had to write la, and then in the other chat it was number 8, and then saying la urid would or just pressing the number would mean that people would leave the chat or opt out and would not receive any further messages from us. At the same time, there was that informed consent piece, which I mentioned. There's also purpose limitations. So the data that we collect will not be used for any other purpose or any other project. Like it's, sort of boxing it within this particular project and purpose. And then data minimization. So we were not collecting names. We didn't ask information about background, about gender, about age. So really only offering a service, right, for now. And then finally, we included a privacy policy and cookies notice, though this is definitely an area of improvement. So the only ones available were in English, which is quite surprising, as IRC's website is pretty trilingual with English, Arabic, and French. So yeah, that's definitely something that for any future chatbots beyond this initial 5 or 6 weeks that we've been running this service, that we'll be working on. And I think it's really important to have an Arabic privacy policy and cookies notice, though I think having them available, though they are quite long documents, and as to whether clients would read them is another matter. Yeah, so just to kind of move on to the discussion then, and conclude and wrap up a bit. So hopefully there you got a sense that chatbots are maybe being built or have been built disproportionately in the region within the humanitarian sector, and that also Arabic-speaking populations are quite a large percentage of total displaced populations, and that there's also high messaging app usage and phone ownership smartphone ownership in the region. So all of these factors combine to mean that humanitarian chatbots or chatbots being used by the humanitarian sector and messaging apps in general, it's kind of a huge or a growing space, and that will likely only continue to grow. And I think for that reason, it's particularly important we have a dialogue between digital rights activists and those humanitarian organizations that are building chatbots in the region. So I'd love to move on to some questions and just really kick off the discussion. Like, how can we digitally engage and communicate with crisis-affected communities responsibly and ethically? How do we balance the right to privacy with other rights, like the right to education? And how might international aid organizations work with social media companies in a way that supports digital rights? So those are some questions I have for you. But we'd just love to open the floor and really start this discussion. And I see Grant has a question. Feel free to drop questions in the chat. So Grant is asking, do organizations running WhatsApp chatbots in the humanitarian field have direct or privileged access to WhatsApp Facebook teams? Yeah, Grant, in short, they do. I think it varies. It varies. So the World Health Organization Health Alert app, Health Alert Chatbot, that was built directly with WhatsApp. And WhatsApp even has a page about that collaboration on their page. It varies from organization to organization. So in order to build a chatbot on WhatsApp, everyone has to go through a third-party provider, which WhatsApp and Facebook call a business solution provider. There's one specifically that's focused on social impact. It's called Turn.io, and it's run by the Pray-Cult Foundation, or it was incubated within the Pray-Cult Foundation. And that's also who WHO built the Health Alert app on, and then the subsequent mental health guide. At the same time, most large organizations, so for instance, IRC, does have a partnerships team. And part of those partnerships are with just about every technology organization you can think of, right? And if a partnership isn't in place, then it's and if it's an area that the organization is moving into, so for instance, WhatsApp, then they would try to develop that relationship. So yes, I'm not actually sure though, just the second part of your question of what are they like, I'm not sure about that yet, but I think one thing that's particularly interesting is given this, or at least to me, is given the scale of humanitarian organizations, to what extent can some of the things that humanitarian organizations and these big like UN agencies or really huge INGOs, what could we bring to the table? Like what could we bring up in discussions that would lead to product or policy changes? So for instance, just give you an example, an issue with WhatsApp is, in order to send, it's very business oriented for now. So in order to send a message out, there has to be like a business use case, like a ticket alert or something, which is very different to the use case that humanitarian organizations have in mind. So that's something that WhatsApp and others are interested in, but and are learning about right now. And equally, humanitarian organizations and others in the sort of social impact space are raising those concerns, all those different use cases and needs to the companies. But to what extent that actually leads to change, and sort of how like a digital rights agenda can be included in that sort of, it remains to be seen, I think. Does that answer your question, Grant? And can we unmute other people on the chat, as it's quite a small group? Yeah, so Grant had a question, which is just about, it does make sense, Grant, thanks, which is just about, can you list some of the privacy concessions you would think might improve the right to education? So that's that's a really good point. I guess I included this question as an example. So on the one hand, organizations looking at the space are thinking about the right to privacy that people have. But at the same time, balancing that with other rights. So right to education, right to health, the right to timely and reliable information, the right to voice concerns, the right to contact an organization. So different rights around needs, and yeah, I'm not sure of some of the privacy concessions that would need to be made. I guess it's of thinking that, okay, if in a context where people are perhaps only using a particular messaging app that has privacy concerns or children are only using that, for instance, or their parents, then what do you do in a context where there's COVID, kids can't go to school, but they still have a right to an education? So what happens there? Yeah, so I think that's what that question was I was trying to get at there with that question. But yeah, I'd love to hear what you think. Hi, Mohammed, welcome. Yeah, so Grant, just thinking more about your question, I think the privacy concessions would be more about, or as we've seen so far, would be more about in the tool that's used. So Facebook versus WhatsApp, for instance. So thinking about some of those earlier chatbot examples, where Facebook Messenger was the option, or was more commonly used, let's say. And now there's been that shift to WhatsApp just because of the greater privacy through the end-to-end encryption, basically, that affords, like, acknowledging that it's not perfect, but that it's better, let's say, than Facebook Messenger. So yeah, and now I'm just seeing Grant's question, which is about organizations could pull data from Messenger in a way they can't from WhatsApp. I think it's two-pronged, Grant. So it's that yeah, the kinds of data that you can pull are really huge. Though of course there are Facebook pages that organizations or projects might run where they can potentially collect some of this data, but it would be less maybe fine detail that you might get with Facebook Messenger. So yeah, there's definitely more analytics with Facebook. And I guess the main concern is just around the fact that that, you know, where is that data stored, and who can see it. So with Facebook Messenger, it would be that it's, that Facebook kind of holds that, stores that. The fact that that Facebook or that it could be potentially used that a person was speaking to X organization about Y issue. So, for instance, if someone was talking to a humanitarian organization about needing economic support or cash, like how might that affect their future ability to get a mortgage or to get a loan or something. So that connection between the data that Facebook gathers and what that might mean for someone's life in the future versus WhatsApp, and particularly for crisis-affected communities who are, considered to be seem to be like more vulnerable, right? Does that make sense? Cool. Thank you, Mossad. Thank you, Grant. Thanks everyone for joining. I think we have just 1 minute left. So if there is anything else, please do feel free to email me, tweet at me, whatever you like. I love to hear from you. And yeah, happy to share any sources and resources as well, if that is of use.